where there was a creature whose tail was like a cedar, we're told, and that was in the book of Job, and that was Leviathan, a creature that we don't know for sure, possibly a reference to a dinosaur. Could have been, because we don't have any creature like that today that would be like that. So these cedar trees, they were kind of legendary because of their excellent timber. And this means that Solomon wants to build the temple out of the very best materials possible. So that's the way it ought to be. We ought to offer the very best. In this case, building a house like that. And so it also means that, well, it means that Solomon's going to do that. He's going to build this great temple. And he's going to use some Gentile wood and some Gentile labor, isn't he? What do we mean when we say he's going to use Gentile labor? Okay, the Sidonians, they're Gentiles. He's going to use quite a few of them, isn't he, in bringing this about? So there wasn't anything wrong with that, because eventually God's going to welcome Gentiles to be his family. And we see pointers throughout the Old Testament of God. God never forgot about the Gentiles. They were not a part of his original plan. His original plan was descendants of Abraham would bring Christ into the world. But Abraham was promised that he would become a great nation. His family would become a great nation. And the plan was for that nation to bless all nations by bringing a Savior into the world, bringing Jesus into the world. So we don't know for sure if Hiram was in a relationship with the Lord in that sense, or if he was a saved man, but he certainly respected the God of Israel. He did that. And that was no doubt due to David's influence, David's godly influence on Hiram, because David and Hiram were good friends, close friends. Now, the deal was, and they kind of made a deal here, Solomon and Hiram did. And what was the deal? What part was Hiram going to provide? He's going to provide the cedars. Is he going to provide any labor? He's going to provide servants, isn't it? What does Solomon say he'll pay the servants? He said, you name the price, I'll pay it. That's pretty, kind of tells you something about Solomon's money that he had, or wealth that he had, and maybe how he looked at wealth. Yeah, when you look at a map, I don't know if we've got one in here. I'll try to put one of those in there next week too. But when we look at a map of that Mediterranean area there, Lebanon is up on the north part of that shore. If you're looking at the Mediterranean Sea in the middle, and you've got Israel and Lebanon and Tyre and Sidon and all up through there, they're going to float those timbers down along the shore all the way down in the water. That's better than carrying them over land, isn't it? Think of how much trouble that would be to carry all the timber to build the temple over land. They didn't have modern highways like we've got today. They didn't have modern machinery to move the land, move the timbers. So the best way to do it would be float them down along the water on the shore. So they floated them in the water down there, and that's how it was going to be done. And Solomon just says, whatever it's worth, I'll pay it. And we see that in what? Yeah, provided food. Yeah. In verse 5 of 1 Kings 5, now therefore command that they cut down the cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will pay you wages for your servants according to whatever you say. I don't make deals like that, do you? I'll say, I just want the job done. You charge me whatever you want to charge me. I'll pay it. That's what he said. For you know there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians. So he's bragging on them. And apparently they had a reputation. They had tools. We don't know exactly what kind of tools they had. Apparently they were adequate for the job, but you know, back some of our ancestors used those cross-cut saws. You got one fellow on one end, another on the other end. There's nothing easy about that. Nothing about that is easy. It's hard work. They may have had something like that. I've seen my grandfather use one. No, I've used this kind where you one person saw. Yeah, well, one person on one end, one's on the other. Yes. That wasn't what he told me. No. 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 There's nothing easy about cutting wood. I had a friend that, well, I conducted his funeral up in Doniphan, Missouri. He ran a sawmill. There is nothing about working around a sawmill that is easy. If you're going there for a job, you better be ready to do some hard work. I had another friend up in Little River, Missouri. Same thing. He worked at a sawmill. And it was hard work. Nothing easy. If you're not really looking for a job that involves hard work, you don't want to go looking there. And so what we're talking about here, we're talking about enough lumber to build the temple. It's going to take a lot. And moving it is a problem. And the best way to do it, they're fortunate they had the water, they could float it down that way. And a lot of times, that's the best way to move things. If you live close to a river of any size, it's going to be used for transporting things. I grew up on the Ohio River up in Kentucky, and I saw a lot of barges carrying things over the years. And that was probably the easiest and best and cheapest way to move those things. If you move them on the highway, you're going to have a lot of semi-trucks, a lot of huge trucks to move all that. But they could get a big barge and float it down the river in one container. Well, anyway, this is what they're talking about doing here. And he bragged on them. There's nobody that has the skill to cut timber like the Sidonians. So it was, verse 7, when Hiram heard the words of Solomon, that he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. Then Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the message which you sent me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and cypress logs. So there's two kinds of wood there, cedar and cypress. My servant shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea. I will float them in rafts by sea to the place you indicate to me, and will have them broken apart there. Then you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household. So we're not told what kind of a price he set. Solomon told him, he said, I'll pay whatever you say. We're not told what he told him. We might be surprised at what he said. But anyway, that's what happened there. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon. They were a good combination, a good team. And Solomon, in his God-given wisdom, continued this friendly relationship between Israel and Lebanon. And that's largely how the temple was built. How many temples end up being built over time? 3. This is the first one here. Then there's the one during the time of Zerubbabel. That's the one with that second temple was not nearly as glorious as the first one. And all the old men who had seen the first temple and are now seeing this one, they weep because it's not nearly as glorious. And then Herod's temple is the third one. So Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, and Herod's temple. Temple got destroyed over time. As long as the work's going on. Yeah. And how many years did it take to build the temple? 7 years to build the temple. So we're talking about a job that's going to last 7 years. And I think that's right. Solomon's going to have to feed them for 7 years. Pocket change to Solomon, I guess. Yeah. It does. It does. And it's going to take a lot of work involved. Cooking, even today, with all the modern conveniences we have, is still hard work. That's something that's probably never going to be totally easy, and that's cooking. But in primitive times, it was really hard work. When you had to build a fire out of stuff, wood and stuff, and do the cooking for thousands of people. Boy, you're going to have a big operation there, aren't you? Going to have a big operation. So, what kind of labor force? How many people in the labor force? According to verse 13 and 14. Okay, verse 13, then King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. That's the labor force. That's just what? Yeah, that's his labor force, yeah. So that's a huge labor force. It shows the temple could only be built when Israel could afford the manpower. You're going to have a lot of manpower tied up here and afford the materials. And probably the only situation under which this can be done would be in a time of peace and prosperity, when you don't need all of these men out there fighting a battle, because armies involve thousands of people, and it's going to take a lot of men to fight an army, and a lot of men to build the temple. So a time of peace and prosperity, which describes Solomon's reign. I don't know, God's providence apparently was involved in that to allow that to happen. But this peace and prosperity, the peace especially, was won by David, and Solomon's benefiting from that and enjoyed by Solomon. And there's a man named Adoniram who's in charge of the labor force. We see that there, the next verse, verse 14. And he sent them to Lebanon. And what kind of a situation was these 30,000 men? What was the situation? 1 month working and 2 months home. Okay, he sent them 10,000 men at a time. 10,000 would go for 1 month. They would be gone from home for 1 month, and then they'd be home for 2 months. And another 10,000 would go in their place, and then another. So they had that all planned out, and that was kind of the I don't know what you want to call it. What? Yeah, the arrangement they had for that, the manpower and the. I guess you would call that shift work, wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be called shift work? Yeah. Yeah, they had different shifts. Month. Yeah, month at a time. Month at a time. We don't know how many hours a day they worked, but I'm sure they took advantage of all the daylight they had. So anyway, Solomon's wisdom is evident in the way that he employed this workforce. The organizing of it is very commendable. He wisely delegated responsibility to certain ones, to men that could do this, like he did to this man Adoniram. And then besides that, instead of making the Israelites work constantly away from home, he worked them in shifts. And so we see that described here. What about slave labor? Was any of that involved? It was. 70,000 men who carried burdens, they're said. 70,000. And 80,000 who quarried stones. I don't know as much about that as I do about wood. I did have a friend that owned a rock quarry up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and I went out there with him several times. There's not anything easy about that either. You're working with stone. There's just, especially when you've got to hew the stones to fit a certain area, like it's got to fit in a certain place. That's right. They did the stones at the quarry. Why did they do that? Yeah, what was it? It says was not heard in the temple. Hammers and chisels, any kind of tool that you normally hear. You get a lot of hammers clanging and chisels. It can be noisy. But none of that was heard in the building of the temple. And that's what we're told there in the passage. We'll come to that in just a minute. And so they quarried all the stones so that they would be the right size and everything to fit, so that they wouldn't have to do it once they got to the... You can imagine if they had to do that after they got to the temple, how noisy that would be. And so it wasn't done that way. And so besides the 3,300 men from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies, what was their purpose? What were these 3,300 men deputies? What was their work? They're supervisors. They see that everybody's obeying the rules. I mean, if you got that kind of a job going on, you're going to have some good supervision. You're going to have some people that can get the people to work and get them to cooperate. So you've got to have people motivators. I don't know what kind of motivation they used, but they had to be motivated. And these were costly stones, we're told. Costly stones. And so this means the stones were quality. They were quality stones, showing that Solomon used the best quality materials to build the temple. And he's building it for God. And so that makes sense. Now, also, we mentioned these deputies. You've kind of got to have some people to enforce. If somebody wants to be lazy and not do his work, somebody's got to have to enforce the rules. And that would be the responsibility of these deputies. And so they're kind of a middle management team, is what they are. They're a middle management team administrating the work of building the temple. And you're going to have foundation stones. Yes, David?
I assume there's also in there a lot of architects, engineers, mathematicians, designers.
Have to be.
Yeah.
Have to be. God's going to give them the measurements, so they've got to have the tools for measuring to do all that. I think people, the newer generations tend to think that people in the past weren't very smart. And that's a mistake, isn't it? Yeah. I like C.S. Lewis. He calls that chronological snobbery. that the present generation tends to think that they're so much smarter than the generations that came before us. And that doesn't always hold true. What? Yeah, God made them all. So there were a lot of things accomplished back in the time, even if the Industrial Revolution hadn't come yet and modern technology, they still had ways of doing things and organizing. And David mentioned architects. You'd have to have architects. Well, you think of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Architecture, how in the world? We don't. David did a lot. He obviously did some of the planning, had things in mind, and Solomon kind of carries them out. Yeah, yeah. I think David was chomping at the bit. He wished he could do it, but he knew God wasn't going to allow him to do it because he had been a man of war. So it's kind of interesting there. But one thing we learn from all this, well, I'll ask you, what can we learn from all this? What did we learn about cooperation? Yeah, we learned that Nehemiah, when they came back to rebuild the walls and the temple after it had been destroyed. People had a mind to work, it says. Yeah. But what we have here is the way we ought to work for God even today. That we don't work for appearance only, but we put our hand to the plow. We put our hand to work. And we cooperate. We work together with others. And when you get people working together for a common cause, you've got a good thing. Got a good thing going there. Well, that kind of takes us through that chapter there, the 5th chapter. Anybody got any comments or question about chapter 5? Who were what? Which verse are you? Verse 13? 18. Yeah, so Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gebalites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stones to build the temple. I'm checking my footnote here.
The workbook said, I think King James must have read stonecutters.
Stonecutters, yeah.
Stone cutting skills.
Yeah, I haven't. I'll have to research that. I haven't researched that. But apparently they were the ones that quarried the stones. But if they were from a particular place, I'm not sure. Well, let's go on to chapter 6 about the constructing of the temple. And we're going to read about the basic dimensions of it. Some of this is kind of tedious reading because you got various sizes and things. But we're told in the beginning of chapter 6 of 1 Kings, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel. How long did Solomon reign? 40 years. So in the 4th year of his reign, still early on, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that would be like February, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So we're told when it started, what year it was. We're not told yet that it's BC, are we? Not yet. Okay. So in the 480th year, this kind of a marking point shows just how long Israel had lived in the promised land without a temple. They'd lived in the promised land for quite a while now, through the time of all the judges, and well, a lot of that went on while they were still in the wilderness, but the time of the kings and the time of the conquering of the land. So quite a bit of time involved there while they had lived in the promised land without a temple. And we talked about the tabernacle earlier, which was a huge tent where was the center of their worship. And that tabernacle had served the nation well for more than 400 years. What was the condition of it at the end of the 400 years? What was the condition of the tabernacle? Was it all worn out? No. Just like the clothing of the children of Israel, during that 40 years wandering, their clothes didn't wear out. I've got some clothes that, lucky if they'll last 4 years, but theirs lasted 40 years. It didn't wear out. And the tabernacle itself, made of cloth, lasted as long as God needed it to use it. And it didn't wear out. So God's hand was in that. And the tabernacle served the nation well during that time. Well, this date that we learn here in chapter 6 and verse 1 kind of gives us also a marking point for the Exodus, for them leaving the Egyptian bondage. And many people suppose the reign of Solomon began about 971 BC and ended in about 913 BC. So that would be the temple was begun in about 967 BC. And that means that the Exodus took place in about 1447 BC. So you can do the figuring there, do the math. You can learn several things from this information that's given in verse 1. You can kind of pinpoint when certain things happened if you do the figuring there. And it says he began to build the house of the Lord. So this was when the actual construction began. Actual construction. And Solomon probably started to organize the work right away. Right away. This is something his daddy had wanted done for a long time. Solomon sees the need to do that. And there seems to be maybe some evidence that it took 3 years to prepare the timber from Lebanon to use in the building. You can't just take a tree and cut it down and start using the wood. You got to do several things to that wood, don't you? You got to skin the bark off of it, take all the limbs off of it. You got to make it straight. You got to cut it into planks or whatever they needed to do. And they did it without an electric saw of any kind. Today we've got all kinds of electric saws. We've got electric hand saws. We've got table saws. It's just astounding what kind of equipment we have today that they did not have. They did it all by hand. But they did it. They accomplished it. And that's really amazing. So he begins this, prepared the timber from Lebanon. And if Solomon began this construction of the temple in the 4th year of his reign, he probably started organizing the construction in the very first year of his reign, because this is not something you can just jump up and do it overnight. There's going to take a lot of planning. And, well, we've all seen architectural drawings, haven't we? Think about that. They're going to have something of that kind. And what are they going to use for paper? You know, we take that for granted. We take paper for granted today. You can get all kinds of sizes of paper. From the Chamber of Commerce, you can get a map of Craighead County or the city of Jonesboro, and when you unfold that thing, it's pretty big. It's all one piece of paper. Making paper back then was a job in and of itself. You couldn't just go to Office Max and buy all the paper you needed. And paper was made out of, especially in around Egypt, papyrus was a plant that grew along the Nile River. And the word papyrus, you can see a form of the word paper. Our word paper comes from that. I've got a piece of papyrus in there. And it kind of had a weave to it. You can see a weave to it. It wasn't smooth paper like we've got where we can write on it. It was a little harder to write on. And what did they use for ink pens? We take all those things for granted, but they had to have all that stuff and to make the architecture's plans. And once they got the architecture's plans, they couldn't run it through a machine and make a copy, could they? If they want another set of plans, guess what they're going to have to do? They're going to have to do it the same way they did the first one. So a lot of things we take for granted. So think about the amount of planning and work that went on even before getting ready to build the temple. A lot was involved. And we probably don't or can't appreciate the work that went into this, because we'll never have to go through what they went through. They say today, building a house is one of the worst experiences you can have. I've been through that once, and once was more than enough. I don't want to ever do it again. And I've heard a lot of other people say the same thing. They build one house, they don't want to do it again because of all the planning that goes in and things you just don't think of. They have to be planned for, taken care of. So you can imagine in this situation how much planning had to go in to building a temple for the Lord. And Solomon's temple was probably the most glorious of all. Well, there's our second bell. So let's mark our places. We're kind of at the beginning of chapter 6 of 1 Kings. And
Good evening, everyone. It's time for us to begin. The first song we're going to sing tonight will be number 500. 500, O thou fount of every blessing, and we will sing all three verses of this song. Do, mi, O thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, all for songs of highest praise. Please me ever to adore thee, may I still thy goodness prove, while the whole of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus saw me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger, interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I constrain to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Never let me wander from thee, never leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. The song of invitation after the lesson will be number 722. 722.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. There we go, there we go, there we go. I just want to make sure everybody's woke. I want everybody to, well, anybody, raise your hand if you've ever taken just a long drive, just a long trip or journey, just to think, reflect on life and just your day-to-day. How many people have ever done that? I'm surprised not all of us have ever done that. Okay, maybe you didn't take a long drive or trip. Maybe you sat out on your front porch or something, right? Yeah, okay. More so that. At the company that I work for, I'm what you call an area manager. And I manage facilities in different parts of Jonesboro, in Manila, in Monette, Leachville, Marston, a lot of different places. And of course, being able to manage all of these facilities, it gives me the chance to travel a little bit and just, you know, get a long drive in, long trip. And of course, what I love about those is having the ability to just take time to reflect on my day, to think about life, you know, itself as, you know, as I get older, think about my family. And what I think about a lot of times when I'm taking these drives is just, you know, first off, how my day went. You know, I think about what I could have handled differently, or how I could have said something better or done something better, a different strategy or approach to something. Most times, some things more related to work, but then in a more general and spiritual sense, I think about also just my life and how I could have done things better spiritually. And I'm sure we've all had those moments. But I want us to turn to the book of Luke, and we're going to look at chapter 15. And everybody knows what Luke chapter 15 is in regards to. Some people call it the parable of the prodigal son, but we're just going to call it the prodigal son. So Luke chapter 15, we're going to start at verse 11. We're going to stop at 19, and then we're going to do a little bit further reading. It says, "Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." So here we have a young man who's he's traveled to a distant country. He's taken a long journey himself. He's taken a portion of his father's estate that belonged to him, and he took all of it, and he decided he was going to leave home. He left home, and he went, of course, out of his father's presence, and he just squandered all of his estate on prodigal living, wasteful living. So now, though his purpose in taking this long journey was not for good intentions, of course, he didn't realize that this long journey is actually what he needed to get things back in perspective, to get his life back in order. So this long journey, of course, caused him to reflect on his life. Of course, we read in the passage where he came to his senses, right? He came to his senses. He thought about all of the things that he had already situated in life, those things that were going good in his life, and he thought about what he had just done. He had took all of his estate that belonged to him, and he just wasted it. So he reflects on his life, he reflects on his attitude, he reflects on the good life that he had back home, the good people that he had in his life that meant him good, meant him well. He reflected on his actions and his attitudes towards God. But I want us to consider also the events after he returned. So he takes another long journey back home, obviously, right? So let's read verses 20 through 24. It says, "And he arose and came to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Now bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry." Now you see, after this hard and humiliating journey, this time away from his father and his family, he only needed to make another journey back towards his father to get things back in order. And the reason why I say he only needed to make a journey back towards his father, because as we read in the passage, he didn't even get all the way to his father before his father met him along the way. And so in making a practical application of that, as we've journeyed far from God, as we've taken our long journey, even with bad intentions, if we just make that one journey back towards God, we don't have to worry about meeting him all the way. Let's just start making that journey back to God. But I don't want us to forget how the brother played in this journey also. Because some of us look down on those who have taken a long journey away from God. We begin to look down on them, and we begin to talk about them, or we don't try to help them get back to where they came or where they fell from. Instead, of course, we should be praying for these individuals. We should be trying to help these individuals in some way. And so it seems that the brother doesn't realize that he too can fall into temptation. And he did. We saw his attitude, right? And we also should understand that just as one who has traveled into a distant country, who has taken this long journey, just as we look down on this person, we can be just as well taking a far journey, or a long journey into a far country, just the same. So we have to put it in our hearts to help our brothers and our sisters to return back to safety and peace. And we have to consider that the previous parables before this talks about a lost coin and a lost sheep, and how the shepherd would leave all 99 sheep just to go after the one. That's the type of attitude that we should have for those who have been lost, who have taken these journeys. But I want us also to think about Peter as well. I want us to read Luke chapter 22. Chapter 22. And I want us to read verses 31 through 32. Because to me, when we think about this parable of the prodigal son, it seemed like the brother should have been taking a long journey also. He needed time to reflect on his behavior and his attitude. Too often we focus on what everybody else should be doing, and we should be focusing on what we should be doing as well. Now Peter, mind you guys, we remember that Judas had betrayed Jesus, right? He fell into the temptation. And then we see here in Luke chapter 22, before we get to the passage that we're going to read, we saw that the disciples were arguing about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. They were talking about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And so we also have Peter here in Luke chapter 22, who said that he was not going to deny Jesus, but of course we know that he denied Jesus, right? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. So let's go ahead and look at verses 31 and 32 of chapter 22 of Luke. It says, "And the Lord says, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." So what that says is, Satan is also looking for others to fall into temptation. We may not be the victim at the moment. We may not have taken this long and ride this journey now, but we could well so do that. And so, before Peter denies Jesus, Jesus has told him, Satan is trying to sift you. He's looking for you. He wants you to fail. And the only reason that Peter didn't fail completely, even though he did falter, was because Jesus prayed for him. He said in verse 32, "But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." And we know that Peter failed, where he faltered, and he failed at the moment. But of course he got back up and he kept going, right? But the key phrase here is, "When you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren." We have a duty to help those who can also fall into temptation. We have a duty to consider ourselves in times of temptation. But the whole point is that we are a team and we are brothers and we are sisters and we're supposed to be working together. There's not going to be a lifetime that goes by and you don't fail in some way. A long journey is no different from a short journey. It's all the same. But I do want to extend an invitation tonight for those who have had a long journey, those who have had a hard and tough time in their spiritual journey, whether you have not become a Christian and life has been a long journey for you, you can make a short journey tonight. All you have to do is allow us and allow God to save your soul, to help pray for you, to forgive you, to strengthen you in some way. And that takes just a short journey. It's not a long journey. So as we get ready to sing the song of invitation, make your needs known and don't be ashamed. Be just like the son who came to his senses. And if you study words, Greek words and things like that, you know, if you have a good habit of doing that, that word or phrase came to his senses means that he just came out of insanity. He was deranged. And he's recognized his condition. Many of us, the problem we have is we don't want to recognize our condition. We just have to have the heart to do so, just like the prodigal son. So as we sing this invitation, please make your needs known as together we stand.
Before we're dismissed tonight, we'll sing the first and last verses of number 121. 121, verse 1 and 4. Whate'er you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. Do not in name of man or creed, do all in the name of the blessed Lord. Do all in His name, His name of the Lord. Do all in the name of the Lord. In word or deed, as God decreed, do all in the name of the blessed Lord. Till toils and labors here are done, do all in the name of the Lord. Dear Christian friends, if you be one, do all in the name of the blessed Lord. Do all in His name of the Lord. Do all in the name of the Lord. In word or deed, as God decreed, do all in the name of the blessed Lord.
Bow with me. Most gracious and awesome Heavenly Father, we come before you now, giving thanks for another good invitation, Lord, and I pray that we take what was said and we bring others back to you, Lord. I pray that we just always be an example for you. Lord, I pray that you be with the sick, that you bring them back to the good health, Lord, and I pray that you be with the spiritually sick, Lord, that you put it on their hearts to come back to you, Lord, and I pray that we be good examples to them, Lord, and I pray that we just always be a shining light in darkness. In Jesus' name I pray.